want to preface my remarks by saying that I was speaking with a friend of mine today about my talk, and I said it's about the difference between Holocaust guilt and Holocaust shame, and he immediately assumed, A, that I was talking about Jewish Holocaust guilt and Jewish Holocaust shame, and B, that shame in his mind was a sort of auxiliary of guilt. In other words, guilt is sort of the cognitive acknowledgement of having done wrong, but shame is the sort of emotional power behind guilt, which I thought was also very Jewish. What in fact I'm talking about is the difference between what anthropologists have in the past called honor-shame cultures, in which guilt is a possibly non-existent part, and what I call integrity guilt cultures, which are built on honor-shame because, as I was just discussing earlier, honor and shame are sort of part of the human DNA, possibly located in the limbic system, the amygdala. But in any case, it's a very powerful and autonomous form of emotional need, the need for honor and the need to avoid public disgrace. And that's the kind of honor shame that I'll be talking about in this talk. And I'm not talking about Jews, I'm talking about Germans, Europeans, and at some point I'll shift to the progressive left in terms of their attitudes towards the Holocaust, towards Israel, and so on. So that said, I'll begin. Feel free to interrupt me if you want clarifications on the spot. Obviously, I don't think this will take too long, so I think we'll have plenty of time for discussion. But again, if you want a clarification as you go, please feel free to interrupt.
Is BU Boston University?
Yeah. All right. When I first heard about journalist Catherine Ney, prominent mainstream French journalist, stating on her Europe 1 news program that, quote, with the symbolic charge of this picture, this death, that is, of Mohammed Abdullah here on the left, erases the picture of the little Jewish boy, hands up in front of the SS in the Warsaw Ghetto, I realized to what extent Europeans had taken the story of the IDF allegedly killing 12-year-old Mohammed Abdullah in the arms of his father as what I termed a get-out-of-Holocaust guilt-free card. At the time, I marveled, and I still continue to marvel, at the astounding folly of this statement. How could a brief, blurry, chopped-up video of a boy who, at best, was caught in a crossfire started by his own people firing from behind him, at worst, an outright fake, which I think it is, how could this picture replace a picture that symbolizes the systematic murder of over 1 million children and their families? How morally disoriented can you get? Apparently, escaping guilt made some people, too many people, do strange things, like adopt a supersessionist narrative in which the Israelis are the new Nazis and the Palestinians the new Jews. Indeed, if the picture replaced any, it was the previous century's blood libels, now grown immensely more powerful through being launched by a self-identified Jew, Charles Alderoy, the journalist for the French correspondent for France 2, and spread as news the globe over by modern news agencies. It's the first blood libel of the 21st century and possibly the most powerful blood libel in the long and unhappy history of that phenomenon. But the profound distinction between guilt and shame suggests that the right formula is a get-out-of-Holocaust shame-free card. I know it doesn't sound as good, but the difference is guilt is an internally generated sense of having done something wrong and the moral obligation to at least try not to repeat past transgressions, especially egregious ones, like the unchecked attempt to exterminate a helpless minority within one's own society. Shame, on the other hand, is externally generated, driven by the shaming look of others, what Anthony Kwame Appiah in his book on these issues called the honor group. The honor group is the group to whom you look for honor. If you get honor from the wrong people, it's not particularly interesting. There's a group that is what defines what you consider honor and what you consider shame. When Germans got caught carrying out a genocide, their nation was not only guilty of the deed, but shamed before the entire, at least Western world. The operative question for each and every German ever since is, do they publicly, does he or she feel bad for Germans doing it? Or does he feel bad for Germans getting caught? Or even more basically, for losing? Therein lies a key difference. For guilt, it's the awareness of the deed and its moral meaning. For shame, it's whether others know and look down on you. In some countries in the world, it's not a question of whether you're corrupt or not corrupt, because everyone is. And everyone knows that everyone is, but just if you get caught. And if you get caught, no one is going to help you lest you drag them all down with you. How many teenagers apologize to parents? This is a personal remembrance. How many teenagers apologize to parents who think they're sorry for doing it when in fact they're apologizing for getting caught? How many consider adultery legitimate as long as no one knows? On some level, we're all subject to these concerns. We're all concerned with how others see us. We all look both ways before violating the rules. It's not that honor-shame cultures don't have moral codes, even ones in which sleeping with another man's wife or cheating and lying to your neighbors or mistreating the minorities in your midst is considered illegitimate. It's that the vulnerability to the fear of shame and the desire for honor is so strong in such cultures that individuals more readily jettison moral concerns in order to preserve honor. Lie, for sure. Kill, if necessary. After all, the limbic dread of shame, its disastrous psychological and practical impact on people, kicks in times of humiliation and fear. Those afflicted with what I am now calling onidophobia, which is the overriding fear of public blame or humiliation. Onida is the Greek term for public fear or humiliation. The desire above all that others not see, not know, not talk about what you've done, that one does not bear the shame of the transgressions and failures publicly, that one need not pay the steep price in social capital for one's misdeeds. Better that someone else pay the price for threatening one's honor. In the world of honor and shame, it's not about who's right. A correct insult is no less an insult than an incorrect one, perhaps more so. Guilt integrity, however, has moral codes that operate from within out rather than from without in. Here, the awareness of transgression and the determination not to do it again operate inside the individual. That process takes both genuine remorse and an understanding of how it could have happened so as to prevent it from happening again. It involves criticism and self-criticism. It involves a willingness, when absolutely necessary, to make the painful sacrifice of public honor in order to maintain private integrity, rather than preserve public honor at the expense of private guilt. And I think one of the best examples of this is the biblical tale of Judah and Tamar, when Tamar sends him the signet and the ring and the staff that he had left with her. He finds out that his daughter-in-law is pregnant, and he says, burn her, which is really one of the early examples of honor killing. And she sends him the signet and staff and ring, and he sees it, and he says, she was more righteous than I. And in saying that, essentially what he was doing was taking a huge hit to his public honor. In fact, he had tried to cover up the incident earlier by saying, let's not talk about it lest we be a laughingstock. He is taking the hit to his public honor in order to maintain his private integrity, as opposed to maintaining his public honor by having her burned and being guilty of burning the woman that he had himself impregnated, not to mention his kids. And I don't think it's an accident that this, out of the children who were saved by this deed of integrity, is the beginning of the line of the Messiah. Oneidophobes, people driven by honor-shame dynamics, avoid being subject to criticism at all costs, especially public criticism. David Price Jones, in a book called The Closed Circle, points out that reforms are particularly difficult in Arab culture when no one wants to undertake an endeavor lest they fail publicly, so they'd rather not try. Such people consider both lying to save face, and where one can get away with it, violence to regain respect, as normal recourse. Lancelot could publicly proclaim his innocence of adultery with Queen Guinevere because he killed everyone who accused him. The shame-driven oneidophobes want the negative spotlight off them at all costs. In cases of those already shamed, they want to have the shame lifted. Much violence is shame avoidance. Much scapegoating is the transfer of shame. Honest searching motivated by well-deserved guilt could have led post-Shoah Germans to become the most substantive academic critics of the Western grand narrative. After all, it wasn't just the lunatics who disliked Jews. As David Nierenberg has documented in his book on anti-Judaism, how many great Western figures, when they bothered to mention the Jews, did so disparagingly as the negative version of their great accomplishment. Instead of viewing this pattern of ancient, medieval, and modern, and now postmodern denigration of Jews as, quote, they must be doing something to make others hate them so, the now penitent, self-critical German might have asked, maybe this has something to do with us and our problems. Maybe anti-Semitism is a Gentile disease. In other words, for example, German historians might have played a leading role in reinterpreting and integrating the story of the Jews into what's known in the biz as majoritarian Western history, to a degree that no earlier Gentile historian had ever done. After all the postmodern multi-narrative projects, one might imagine that this one promised quite an academic bounty. The Hebraic contribution could be used to challenge the self-absorbed narcissistic quality of the postmodern Western grand narrative that so grated on the postmodern sensibilities. Certainly, given the abundance of evidence of the links between Judaism and the modern values of democracy and equality, it was a promising avenue for research. As Bernard-Henri Lévy put it in response to a critique that he had basically described Judaism as the religious version of progressive values, in fact, one could argue that progressive values were a secularization of Jewish values. and how appropriate for Germans to engage in that exploration of a culture which, in their self-destructive madness, their fathers had tried to exterminate, and had instead brought another megadeath upon the world. That awareness, in fact, and this is what I'll conclude with later, might serve Europe well at this time when it needs to defend the best of what it has become. Some German theologian scholars did explore the problematic nature of Christian supersessionism and the moral failure of those theologians of dialogue in the Weimar Republic who, when implored by their Jewish partners to help against the Nazis, we're talking about Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, spurned them on the grounds that they had squandered their opportunity to convert to the true faith, Christianity. Playwrights and novelists explored the complicity of the German people. Indeed, in the 1980s and 90s, we saw a good deal of Philo-Judaism in Europe, and Germany in particular, and certainly, in comparison with Japan, Germany went much farther in its acknowledgement of its war crimes. The real issue then was, and is, how much of the public regret reflected an acceptance of shame, itself better than the Oneida-phobic Japanese refusal to even acknowledge wrongdoing, and how much reflected also an inner acceptance of guilt. Günter Grass put his finger on the issue in his famous scene where the good bourgeois German couple are walking past a jewelry shop at night, and Oscar shatters the vitrine of the store with his shriek. They look up and down, realize that they're alone, and grab the jewels. If no one sees, it doesn't really count. There's nothing to hold you back. Translated into our understanding of Western civilization, if no one sees you as a historian of Western culture, cheating by giving outsized credit to your own favorites, Greece and Rome, and belittling another contributor, Israel, the Jews, then what's to stop you? Not intellectual integrity. Anyone who challenges you can be dismissed. Your reputation, if not your accuracy, remains strong. I personally was astonished when I was finally introduced systematically to Western political thought as a postdoc at Columbia in 1984. My friend Mark over there remembers this well. To find that virtually everyone began the story with Socrates and Plato, that is 5th to 4th century BCE, Athens, and paid no attention to the Bible, 12th to 6th century BCE, as a political document, despite its remarkably modern resonance. And here I'm referring to a book I recommend to you all by Joshua Berman called Created Equal, in which he treats the book of Deuteronomy as a constitution for a society of free peasants. And in the ancient world, free peasants is an oxymoron. And it's a remarkable book, and one of the things he points out is that there's more resonance between the Constitution in Deuteronomy with the American Constitution than all of the thought in Europe between the Greeks and the point of American democracy. Instead, with a perduring consistency, far too many great Western thinkers right up to the present have adopted the supersessionist tendency to define Jews and Judaism as the negative shadow of their great light, which of course goes back to Greece and Rome. Thus, only a handful of mostly Jewish scholars have tilled these exceptionally rich fields of Jewish biblical origins to Western freedom and democracy. Were these attitudes and awarenesses more mainstream today? Were they part of the overall narrative of self-understanding? Supporters of the Western grand narrative might not have to bemoan their own inexplicable impotence in the face of current feral assaults from both right and left. And here I'm referring to an essay by David Brooks about, whatever happened to Western Civ. And part of the problem with Western Civ is that it is half the story. Supersessionism. Does everybody know what supersessionism is? Supersessionism is a problem. It's a secondary monotheistic problem. Christians start with it. they supersede, they literally sit on top of Jews. They replace, they erase the Jews. The Jews are dechosen, unchosen. God divorces the Jews because they are the true Israel. So it's a very zero-sum attitude towards chosenness. In order for me to feel that I'm chosen, I have to be sure that you are unchosen. Supersessionalism, like all triumphalist religiosity, is shame-honor driven. It needs to visibly dominate others as a sign, a proof that one is right. In the Western monotheistic and atheistic case, the belittling of predecessors provides proof that one is at the moral cutting edge of humanity with no rivals. And I mean, so the second case of supersessionism we get is Islam, which believes that it has replaced both Christianity and Judaism. And the third case, which I will conclude with, is what I call secular progressivism, which believes that it has replaced Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Here, Samuel Pepys comments on his first exposure to Jews who, in Restoration England, were once allowed back into the country from which they had been banished in 1298. Unbeknownst to him, he clearly asked no questions, he had come to a Simchat Torah services. And this is his comment. But Lord, to see the disorder, laughing, sporting, and no attention, but confusion in all their service, more like brutes than people knowing the true God, would make a man forswear ever seeing them more, and indeed I never did see so much, or could have imagined that there could be any religion in the world so absurdly performed as this. That's a good example of superstition. In today's world, it's not fastidious wags like Pepys who play this game, but Pomo Poco deconstructive performers. Pomo Poco is my abbreviation for postmodern, postcolonial. Pomo Poco deconstructive performers and intersectional justice warriors. We, they say, are the true leaders with the true teaching. Do not listen to the chatterings of others, especially the Israel firster Jews. They're speaking roils the consensus we have created by shaming anyone who dissents. Do not invite them to speak at academic venues like SOAS, the School for Oriental and Asian Studies in London, where I'm quoting now the response of professors at SOAS protesting Mark Regev's giving a talk there. Since in doing so it would, quote, create controversial and fraught exchanges, and we do this all to assure talks in which no sound scholar could possibly see any value. Supersessionism worsens as it gets deliberately zero-sum. In order to prove my superiority over those I displace, I must degrade the remnant of those that I should have surpassed and replaced, but who stubbornly persist after my world-transforming appearance on the human scene. My self-identity as the moral leader of mankind demands the public humiliation of my rival. The more publicly, the better. What better way to resolve the anxiety of influence than killing, in quotes, one's begetter through systematic degradation? What more satisfying emotion than to look down my nose at a contemptible predecessor? This is my understanding of why the global progressive left has turned on Israel so savagely in the 21st century. In adopting the Israeli Nazi Palestinian Jew replacement narrative, they managed to place themselves high above everyone else. Not only the Arab Muslims, who they see as far beneath them, worthy of pity, but more importantly, the Jews who have now, quote, lost the high moral ground, as UN representative and Oslo promoter Terje Roed Larsen.
Terry.
What?
Terry.
Terry?
Pronounced Terry.
Terry Roed Larsen, thank you. Said in the wake of the Jenin massacre, The insatiable appetite of allegedly progressive people like Justin Garder for stories of autonomous Jews, that's my term for Israelis, behaving badly is nothing short of breathtaking. Indeed, the entire school of lethal journalists that's emerged and dominated coverage in the 21st century Middle East that caters to this unseemly appetite of supersessionists for the moral schadenfreude of verbally abusing autonomous Jews, what in the old days people called Jew baiting, and what we might call verbal defecation, is nothing short of amazing. And mind you, verbal defecation differs from bullshitting someone because it's shitting on someone. Glad somebody gets my jokes.
Can you repeat what Larson said?
Larson said that Israel had lost the moral high ground as a result of a false narrative of a Jenin massacre. What was in fact at Jenin one of the most remarkable cases of urban warfare, in which the ratios were literally 3 combatants to 1 civilian. And the best rates of civilian combatant casualties in urban warfare tend to be more 3 civilians to 1. So this is a reverse of it. Absolutely extraordinary. Was reported by Palestinians as, you know, the massacre of hundreds, if not 1,000 Palestinians. The media ate it up, and for 3 weeks the West was in a frenzy of anti-Zionism, to the point where you actually had demonstrations against Israel in which Europeans wore mock suicide belts to show solidarity with the Palestinians, not understanding that they were showing solidarity with jihadis who were also targeting them and who would very soon turn their attention to them. When Europeans or Christians adopt the Palestinian replacement narrative, when universalization of the Holocaust leads to silence about its prime victim, the driver of the megadeath industry, when academics and politicians engage in Holocaust abuse by replacing the old Jewish victim with the new Palestinian victim, denouncing Israel's genocide against the Palestinians, as recently done in the Black Lives Matter movement, they reveal that they are driven not by Holocaust guilt, but by Holocaust shame. And the result is the exact opposite of what one should expect. Instead of making sure they don't participate in another genocide against the same people their forefathers had so grievously treated only a couple of generations ago, the German expression is nie wieder, never again, they adopt the narrative of those who would finish the job. There are hard obsessional versions of this to be found both at the extremes of the right and even more widely spread among the left, especially the intersectional left. But there are other forms of shame-driven depreciation of Jews, less obvious but not without their impact. The same Western civ guys who consider Jews free riders benefiting from, but not agents of Western civilization, tend to also consider the creation of Israel as the result of the Holocaust rather than of Jewish agency. Somehow those Jews always manage to benefit from our generosity and our hostility. At a time when the West does not know how to react to the assault of caliphators, would Europeans, Westerners, not benefit from looking at Israel as an autonomous agent on the same side, on the same struggle, rather than project upon her all their own past sins and join their joint enemies, the jihadis, in ganging up on her? The rubber hit the road at the turn of the millennium, when the Western public sphere, an internet globalized public sphere, itself an astounding creation, found itself under assault by a civilizational enemy, one who hated both the liberal West and still more the revolutionary and gender-equal transgressive postmoderns. Rather than democratic forces uniting against theocratic imperialism, it became open, liberal, good people on the left against tribal, Islamophobic, bad people on the right. At this moment of civilizational crisis, the good people, in particular, showed almost no recognition of the many roles Jews and Israel had played in the creation of a global civil society and continue to play in its maintenance. In radical contrast to those who love the protocols of the elders of Zion, like the Nazis or the jihadis, who think democracy is entirely the product of the Jews, Darwin and Nietzsche and the protocols are the dupes of malevolent Jewish genius, most liberals would be at a loss to speak more than vaguely of the Jewish contribution to the creation of modern democracy. Far from considering Jews as a resource and valuable ally in a battle of civilizational values, the progressive left, at the very least, more broadly the liberal left, considered autonomous Jews inconvenient. The French word is gênant. Embarrassing, at the very least. As a result, in the opening years of the new century, they did not hesitate to treat Israel with violent contempt. And here, one of the first people to really address this was Natan Sharansky with his 3Ds, demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. And forced diaspora Jews to either denounce Israel or go to another diaspora, this time exiled from the leftist world of postmodern power, the information professionals. Whether they knew it or not, they were siding against the Jews and with the barbarians. In particular, the German left illustrates a remarkably supersessionist attitude towards Israel, which not only led them to devour the poisonous lethal narratives from the Second Intifada, Al-Dura, Jenin, but also, in the case of the Linke Party, the Left Party, in 2006, for example, to march in gender-separated pro-Hezbollah demonstrations. When you think of it, if you had said to the founders of Hamas, the signers of the Hamas Charter in 1988, that within 20 years, and this is Hamas charter that calls for the genocide of the Jews and quotes the protocols of the elders of Zion as if it's a historical document, and has ambitions to the global dominion of Islam. If you had told them that within 20 years, Western infidels would be shouting, "We are Hamas," in the streets of European cities, they would have responded, "Only Allah can make somebody that stupid." Gunther, whatever his earlier contributions to German introspection, Günter Grass's 2012 poem, What Must Be Said, shows neither a trace of self-awareness in his motivation, in his mind he occupies the high moral ground, nor an understanding of the difference between a nuclear-armed Israel and a nuclear-armed Iranian regime driven by an apocalyptic theology. Eldad Beck argues that by externalizing Germany's responsibility with grand monuments and city centers and commemorative plaques and speeches and public debts to Israel, it actually avoids any real sense of guilt and serious self-reflection. When confronted with Muslim immigrants who objected violently to the teaching of the Holocaust in the schools, they folded. If anything, the post-grand narrativists, and one of the characteristics of postmodernity is to say there are no more grand narratives. And what they really mean is we reject the Western grand narrative. They in fact fall right into another grand narrative. But if anything, the post-grand narrativists, for whom the Western narrative is an ugly succession of oppression and injustice, they see the national autonomous Jews, Israel, as the last remnant of Western racist imperial colonial past. Israel ist unser Unglück. For most major modern thinkers about Western civilization, the Jews were a marginal part of the tale, victims of lamentable Western intolerance, read aggressive supersessionism, benefactors from, but not actual contributors to, that great Western civilizing venture that brought us the modern world's bounty of rights and freedoms and material abundance. In the mid-aughts, that's the first decade of the new century, I spoke to a joint Jewish-German dialogue in Boston. I had been told, we're in the building with the AJC, this was through the auspices of the AJC in New England, I had been told by one of the organizers that the Germans were depressed. They had no sense of purpose or identity about which to be proud. So I spoke to them about how their generation is the best placed to tell the Arabs and the rest of the Muslim world to beware the apocalyptic conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Every German embassy and consulate, I argued, especially in the Arab and Muslim world, should have a display filled with the wisdom of German penitential awareness of how the poisonous impact of that forgery on their self-destructive German madness of their parents, how that had played out. Their past sins, I argued, had placed Germany in the unique position in the global community to stand in the gap against the rising tide of jihadi anti-Semitism. The response? Anybody want to guess?
Zero.
I didn't come here to be fed this Islamophobic nonsense.
Oh,
They were not about to challenge the consensus, to defy the group mind, or maybe to give up the thrilling moral titillation of having the Jews, the Israelis, take their place in the global hot seat of shame and degradation. Years later, in 2011, when I spent a year in Germany, I was surprised to hear them say, we're more afraid of our own fascism than that of our Muslims. And I would say back to them, listen, as a Jew, I would rather deal with a post-Holocaust German than a pre-Holocaust Muslim. They didn't. How much stronger they'd be had they worked on redeeming their guilt by understanding Jews better rather than on escaping their shame by, in a fit of moral pretension, despising them and, in order to do so, elevating the enemies not only of the Jews, but all infidels everywhere, and thereby empower the world of religious intolerance, whose rejection founds the core of modern democracy. Rejecting religious intolerance, refusing the political power to coerce religious belief, is the bedrock of modern democracies. And here they are siding with the very people who want to throw that out. Maybe they would be, today, strong enough to refuse the blandishments of what I call proleptic dimitude. Does everybody know what a dhimmi is? Dhimmi? So a dhimmi is the status of a Jew or a Christian in Muslim society, and it reflects the supersessionist attitude of the Muslims, which is, we'll let you live, but on condition that you accept a degraded status, both legally and publicly. You are
Second class.
second is
Too hard.
very generous.
Yeah.
Very.
And proleptic dimitude is anticipatory dimitude. In other words, behaving like a dhimmi without having been conquered. And I would argue that is our problem in the West today. Many of our leaders are in fact proleptic dhimmi. Did you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to point out the reason I agree with you that second-class citizenship is negative, because second-class citizenship involves the word citizen, and dimitude does not.
You have no
There's no
legal
citizen.
rights. You can't take an Arab to court. You can't give testimony in court. And that gets us to the core of the difference between guilt and shame. The shamed want nothing so much as to divest themselves of their shame, especially if it's global, if an entire people are shamed. If that means putting some other people in the spotlight of global shame, so be it. And if they are also responsible for one's shaming, as in, there's a great article entitled, "Europe Will Never Forgive the Jews for the Holocaust," then so much the better. Hence the Europeans with their global shame for the Holocaust and the Arabs with their global shame for failing to strangle infant Israel in its cradle both share a special supersessionist, shame-driven eagerness to degrade Israel in order that the Jewish state's shame will erase and replace their own. If Europe is to survive, to fight back, to defend the remarkable freedoms and citizens' rights it's already achieved, then it should sooner turn away from Holocaust shame and dive into Holocaust guilt. In the end, it would be a win-win-win for Europeans, for democracies, for Jews, Israelis, and for the vast majority of peaceful Muslims who want to join the 21st century community of nations, ready to live in peace and in equality with those who do not share their faith. Around 1010, a French publisher told me that a journalist had asked him on what calendar date should the EU commemorate its creation. And his response was Holocaust Day. An answer that I, as a medievalist familiar with the longue durée of European history and their constant wars between various kingdoms, found quite compelling. Only in repentance for its treatment of Jews and its embrace of a peaceful global community, the UN, the Geneva Conventions, and so on, were Europeans able to set behind the millennia of war and violence and join together in a consensual, positive-sum union. Perhaps if he had been taken seriously, the EU would not be in such bad shape today. Perhaps it could understand the Jews in Israel are their best allies in the struggle for social justice, and more to the point, in this battle with triumphalist Islam. Perhaps then European thought leaders would begin to reverse their own goal approach. For those of you who don't play soccer, own goal is when you score a goal for the other side. To reverse their own goal approach to the war between Israel and its neighbors, so finely illustrated recently in the UN Resolution 2334, that strengthens their enemies and weakens their friends. Thank you. So yes, I'm open to questions, comments. Yeah.
Well, I think I speak for all of us. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. First of all, I think it's 8 papers, not 1. It's like that very intense tea that some Hasidic communities prepare before Shabbat, you know, to make other tea from.
I've been told that reading me is like drinking from a fire hydrant.
I very much, as a psychiatrist, I very much appreciate your organizing it around this psychological differentiation, in which, as I understand what you're saying, and I'm just absorbing it right now, but in which, in this notion of, you know, there is some a recognition of responsibility for some horrific act, but in point of fact, as you point out, what you do with that can bifurcate to the shame thing, which turns out to be a horrific response, versus the guilt thing, which turns out to be, as in the case of Judah, a positive response. I really, really like that understanding, because it helps me understand what I've always not understood is how did Baader Meinhof come out of Germany? Right?
That's interesting.
So thank you for
It reminds me of something that Vladimir Putin said too. Did you see the interview with, what's her name?
Megyn Kelly.
Megyn Kelly that was just broadcast
Oh, okay,
a couple of
no.
days ago? She was trying to get him to admit that Russia had somehow dealt with Trump to undermine Hillary Clinton. They kept coming back to it in various ways. And he kept telling her, no, this is not so, it's not so. And finally, in ultimate exasperation, but calmly,
Right.
the KGB wizard said, this reminds me of anti-Semitism. It's a conspiracy. It's a story invented to fend off the people who can't take the blame for losing. It's the losers justifying their existence.
Right, it's a scapegoating.
Right. Well, more than that, it's a way of not just scapegoating, but elevating yourself
Right.
and exonerating yourself. Oh, I didn't lose the election. He cheated. So that's one of the things. Your humor is terrific. I can't wait. When does it see the light of day? It's going to
The book? I'm really hoping that I will be done with it before the fact. I want it out of my life. I've been promising it for 10 years. The title was inspired actually by the Fort Hood massacre, in which, you know, Major Hassan had literally been giving lectures on jihad to his colleagues and nobody said anything. And the DOD report afterwards refused to, there's, the only mention of Islam is in the title of an article in a footnote.
No, it was workplace violence.
Right, it was workplace violence, and at that point, I believe, they coined the term pre-post-traumatic stress disorder. Pre-post-traumatic stress disorder.
For one. Major son.
Did you?
Were there no European historians that go along this line that you're proposing for them?
Look, there are some. They are really not at all in the mainstream. I mean, I remember I was at Columbia. I was in the Society of Fellows, and we had a curriculum and stuff. So at the end of the year, I said I'd like to present a case for giving a week to the Hebrew Bible as a political document, and even my good friends said, forget it, drop it. It's like, because for most Westerners, secularism is an absolutely key ingredient of modernity, and therefore if you associate it with something like Judaism, it can't be modernity. As a medievalist, my argument is that the modern era starts at the turn of the 10th, 11th century, the turn of the millennium. And for the first 500 years, modernity has a religious garb. And then it shed that religious garb, but not really, in the subsequent period. But, I mean, there's a whole school, it's almost all Jewish, of people, Yoram Hazony, and there's a publication called Political Hebraism. There's a great professor at Harvard, Jewish fellow named Nelson, who wrote a book called, I think it's Political Hebraism. And he points out that the really radical democratic thought that threw off monarchy, because there was a lot of political thought that said, well, you've got monarchy and you've got republic and you've got, I forget what the third option was and so on. But the moment at which Western thinkers turned radically against monarchy is as a result, and he documents this, as a result of the translation into Latin of the rabbinic discussion of monarchy. Yes?
I have an observation. I'm just wondering if you'll agree with it. I certainly agree with everything you said about the Germans expiating their guilt, shame by dumping on Israel.
Right.
But I think it took 50 years to happen. And they used another mechanism before that that's called denial. It was those Nazi gangsters that took over the country, not us.
Right.
Or the other side of that coin, I was just following orders.
Right.
And I think during most of my lifetime until this, that's all I heard. And after the war, the hardest thing to find in Germany, let's say at the time of the Nuremberg trials, was a Nazi. There weren't any Nazis. It was those gangsters, except for the few that they had locked up.
Actually, I don't know if you've read this book. There are two studies of this case of the 101st Police Battalion that was stationed in Poland. They were the ones who were the first ones given the orders to exterminate the Jews. And they were literally going village by village, rounding men, women, and children up, shooting people who were too sick or old to do it, marching them out and shooting them at point-blank range. And they were given the choice of not doing it, and very few took that choice up. And then in the 1960s, there was a series of trials of these people in Germany. And for me, the most astonishing thing was that the people who had refused said, I refused to do it because I was weak. Yeah. I mean, you know, after the war, they could have said, oh, you know, look at me, I refuse to do it. But in fact, what drove so many of them not to break with this and to stand up for their integrity was precisely this issue of public shame. They were peer group pressured. The commanders were not forcing them to do it. Nobody was punished for refusing. And yet the peer group pressure from the others was so strong that 20 years later, after, you know, the Holocaust shame had hit big, they were still in this world. It's really quite remarkable. Now, your point is well taken that the first period was different, but what's striking about the moment that Adua hits the scene in the dawn of the 21st century is that up until then, one of the things that their shame had imposed upon them was not verbally defecating over Israel. They felt restrained, and it was true in France too. And one of the things that this image did was to literally unleash 50 years of repressed crapping on Jews. I have a friend who was in Paris at the time, Nidra Polar, and she said, you know, it was just staggering that if you defended Israel, this is great, if you defended Israel, people would say, oh, I didn't know you were Jewish. And Gentiles told me that this happened to them, that they defended Israel and people would say, oh, I didn't know you were Jewish. And so in 2006, again with the AJC, there was a talk by the new French consul to Boston from France, and he was Jewish. And I didn't ask him in front of everybody, but afterwards I said, you know, I hear that in Israel today, people say, you know, if you defend Israel, you're considered Jewish. And his response to me was, yeah, sure. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, who but a Jew would defend Israel? Right? So there really is, this unleashed, I think your point is right. There's a denial, there was all sorts of ways of avoiding it, but one of the things that they felt restrained about was assaulting Israel verbally. And after this picture, after the Intifada, after these, you know, this lethal journalism, I define lethal journalism as reporting one side's war propaganda as news. Normally, war propaganda is patriotic. You report your own side's war propaganda as news. Now we have own goal war propaganda. We have Western journalists who are reporting jihadi war propaganda, the propaganda of their enemies as news to their Western infidel audience.
One other question, only because I don't remember. What did Eichmann say at his trial? I know he did a lot of talking, but I just don't remember what he said to justify or explain
I think
what
he was the
done.
quintessence of I was just following orders.
Yeah.
Yes?
The other side has had an impact on Jew becoming a Nazi.
Right.
After the Yom Kippur War, the '67 war, the Palestinians began to, with the help probably of the Russians, to create imagery which I'd be interested in your talking about what they have done to drive this phenomenon and what we haven't done to pick up what they have done and what we've let be done to us.
Right. It's worse, what we've done to ourselves. I did a review of this book by Edward Alexander that I recommend to you all called Jews Against Themselves. And it's a series of essays that he wrote over time. He's an English professor, he writes beautifully, and he really hits the nail on the head repeatedly. And at the end of his essay, after Sabra and Shatila and the First Lebanon War, he talks about how, you know, all of a sudden there were these Israeli professors that nobody had ever heard of who were coming out and talking about Judeo-Nazis, and they were gobbled up by the Western press, right? And the degree to which Jews have joined in this, I mean, I left it out of the paper, but one of the things that happens after the Jenin massacre is that diaspora Jews find themselves enormously on the defensive, and somebody like Tony Judd writes this grotesque piece for the New York Review of Books, in which he basically says, look, you know, Israel, why can't you be more like Europeans, right? As if the Europeans could behave the way they behave if they had neighbors like we do. And basically dismissing Israel as a sort of leftover ugly remnant of the colonial imperial past of the West. And it's just, it's breathtaking. And here is an identified Jew, secular. There's a whole category of people that are known as Jews. And Jews are people who, like Harold Pinter, brilliant, successful, and so on, whom Jews knew was Jewish, but most Gentiles didn't. He never advertised the fact that he was Jewish in any way, shape, or form. And then all of a sudden, after Muhammad Abdullah and stuff, as a Jew, I have to denounce Israel. So there's a real problem there that Jewish, I don't call it self-hatred, I call it self-debasement. Jewish self-debasement has played a key role, but I'm not answering your question.
Well,
Go ahead.
I'll continue with the other side,
Right.
because the other side has been very successful in their propaganda, and they have probably picked up the other side of the stuff that they're talking about and figured it out, how to do what to do to make us more self-hating. Now, and, I mean, just take the New York Times, for example, which I've studied carefully for many years.
Really?
Anybody who's
I stopped reading it. I mean, I read articles occasionally, but I don't read it.
I've studied it.
Right.
And taught about it. And over 2 or 3 decades, Jews will internalize that message. Okay? It's not that they're necessarily starting out as self-hating,
Right.
but we have provided, they have become, in a sense, the textbook for Israel over all this time, because nobody else has written a textbook on Israel, or stood up and created it. So we've been internalizing, we've been eating this poison for all these years. So we may not have started out that way, but the other guys are doing a job on us, and I think we have to look at what they're doing and how they have taken advantage of the kind of thing that you're talking about to bring us to the place that we're at today.
So, I mean, one of the interesting things about what you say is that, you know, in 2001, on the anniversary of the outbreak of the Intifada, Deborah Sontag, the then correspondent, Middle East correspondent for the New York Times, wrote a 5,000-word article about how you can't blame Arafat for the failure of Camp David. And she started the revisionism in which Arafat, you know, the whole thing about the Bantustans and so on and so forth. I think the New York Times is deeply problematic. And I think, I wrote an essay about what I call proxy honor killings. An honor killing is when a member of your family has done something that shames the family, and you kill the person to restore family honor. Israel has done something, and it's not that Israel's done something. The media has reported that Israel has done something that deeply shames liberals and progressive Jews in the West. They don't have the cuyones to kill Israel, but by proxy, they empower the people who do one. And that's all these Jews who are in favor of BDS, Jewish Voice for Peace. You know, J Street says it's against it, but J Street, you know, as Dershowitz pointed out, you can't find anything positive about Israel in J Street stuff. They just, they obsess over everything that's wrong with Israel. And there's this, you know, Matthew Friedman's talked about the cult of the occupation, in which, you know, the occupation has, the Israeli occupation on the West Bank has become the sort of, it's got religious significance as this immensely powerful evil that is, as some of my settler friends say, you know, by building a porch, I'm blocking world peace, you know, and it's ludicrous, but it's true in the minds of the people, you know, who obsess over every plank that's put down on the West Bank. So I think you're right. I'd be very interested in your work on the New York Times.
I wrote a letter that was published by the Jewish Week, which said, called Making Israel's Case. And it said that the occupation really, there's no occupation, it ended with Oslo, because Palestinians are living in their own area. And everything else in the settlements that were agreed to, that Israel had control of Area C. So everybody I've taken that to, every Israel supporter, has rejected it. So what do you mean?
Yeah. It has to be our fault. So after Jenin, a friend of mine, a doctor who was involved with the Israeli army, is walking through Jenin with this reporter, and this lethal journalist is saying, well, you know, of course they want to blow themselves up amongst your civilians. It's all the occupation. And he said, look around you. We haven't been occupying this place for the last 10 years. Do you see a playground? Do you see anything? They've had control of their lives, and they have done nothing but continue their misery. But, you know, for her, the occupation is, actually I've coined the term sequential dyslexia, which is the cart before the horse. You know, the occupation is the cause of the problem rather than the problem is the cause of the occupation. Yes?
I presume that you're an active professor at BU.
No, I retired, thank God.
Oh, I wondered how you can weather the storm that must be on the
that's why I refer to the internal exile of Jews who don't turn against Israel from their progressive, you know, I'm a child of the 60s. I, in fact, have some fairly radical thoughts and so on, but as soon as, my book starts with a list, you'll appreciate this. The book starts with a list of what I call astoundingly stupid statements of the 21st century. And the definition, to make the list, it has to be morally and or empirically ludicrous, like this one. And when you say it, people go, uh-huh. And the first one that came to mind when I started the list was the comment of a colleague of mine who was, you know, I would say my best friend in terms of sort of interesting conversations and so on, intellectual companion. I came to school one day looking troubled. He said, what's wrong? I said, you know, these suicide bombings, they're every week. It's unbelievable. He said, yeah, what choice do they have?
What?
What? Yes. What choice do they have? And that was widespread attitude. That's what Sherry Blair was saying. There was a suicide bombing. She said, well, you know, I mean, they have no choice. They're desperate, you know. And what she means by that is, first of all, she has no moral standards for them, so blowing themselves up among civilians is like their only choice. And secondly, the implication is the Israelis must be doing terrible things to them to drive them to that desperation, right? I mean, you can't get stupider than that. And yet, widespread assent in the West, suicidal assent. Yes, so being a professor at BU after the year 2000 was an increasingly unhappy experience.
Now I understand.
And not only am I glad to get out, I was telling my friends this earlier, when I was a kid, my father was a professor, history professor, and we were at Berkeley for many years. And then in 1963, we moved to Cambridge. And spring of 64 was the free speech movement. My father was getting these letters from his colleagues at Berkeley with clippings from the school newspaper about what was going on. And I remember him pacing in his office and muttering, thank God I left, thank God I left. And, you know, I read about what goes on at Evergreen State and, you know, all of these places where this insane behavior is going on, and I go, thank God I left. It's insane. Yes?
Well, I didn't leave. I'm still at CUNY, wonderful CUNY.
Oh my God.
And anyway, so I want to ask you something though. I didn't quite follow the end of what you were saying. Did you say that the antidote to all of this blaming Israel and dumping it on Israel would be that if Europe accepted its own guilt? Does that make
Yes,
sense?
I think that if Europe were to actually feel guilty rather than just feel shamed, if they were actually to feel guilty, it would lead to a process of self-examination whereby they would rethink who the Jews are and what their relationship to the Jews are.
But isn't part of it like impossible because if they're not Jewish, and even if they're Jewish, but the whole like non-Jewish Christian world
Right.
believes that we killed their
Well, post-Christian world.
Christ, right?
Not
Right.
anymore.
So I mean, like even if they don't consciously believe it or if they don't really acknowledge that, so in a certain way, like anything is justified against the Jews because we killed their savior.
So
According to them.
yes and no. I mean, first of all, the case can be made that democracy comes to the West at the point where Christians begin to give up this kind of attitude. George Washington's attitude towards the Jews was nothing like what you're describing.
Yeah, but he's not the common person.
Well, you know, I'm actually, I would say less impressed since the year 2000 with America, but I'm pretty impressed with the American people. First of all, I don't have the kind of, I would consider them silly expectations of the moral perfectionists that, you know, gives us something like Howard Zinn, who looks at the American Revolution and says it wasn't really a revolution. Yes, it was. It was an amazing revolution. And it's one of the few revolutions that didn't devour itself like the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, etc. So, you know, but he looks at it and he says, well, it's not good enough for me, and therefore I can disparage it. So I don't have those kinds of expectations. I think America, and I think that largely Anglo-Christianity and to some extent Franco-Christianity in the modern period really did do something in that direction. Now, I agree with you, there's a huge sort of inertial aspect to this, so that, for instance, right after the Jenin massacre, what lethal journalists do is they run these stories until they prove to be wrong, and then they go looking for the next story they can run. So after Jenin, it was the Bethlehem siege. And an Italian newspaper ran a picture of baby Jesus saying, now they're coming after me, right, again. And recently, in the coverage of the UN Resolution 2334, there's a CNN reporter who says, an Old Testament Israeli response on a New Testament holiday, right? I mean, so you're right, this stuff is deep. Look, to go back to our discussion of the amygdala and the limbic system, envy is built into human beings. And I personally think that envy and resentment at Jewish success is a very deep element in anti-Semitism. And so it's never going to go away. The question is, are people capable of overcoming it? And when they are, they can have democracies, and they can have freedoms, and they can have civil societies. And if they can't overcome it, they will destroy what they've built. And that's what I see happening today, and I think it's a total catastrophe, and I just don't even know what
You started your discussion saying we're not going to talk today
about Jewish
about Jewish.
Holocaust guilt and shame.
Well, when pushed to shove, somebody would say a Jew,
Right.
oh, Israel was too expensive if you put it against the Holocaust. And that's what I was thinking you might get into how to counter that. Yeah, I know, it's not revisionism, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, it took the Holocaust to get Israel in Israel.
Oh, no,
Oh, it took all the lives?
Yeah.
no, wait, it took the Holocaust to create Israel?
Or just, I don't know.
It was not the Holocaust, then Israel couldn't.
Right, right. So there was,
And then Israel being too
right,
expensive.
there was a very good essay which I linked to in the written version of this that inspired some of my remarks by Einat Wilf. in which she said, you know, part of the problem when you say, and this was the position that Obama basically assumed, I mean, he didn't argue for it, it was just in his thinking, in his speech in Cairo, which is that, you know, the Holocaust led to the creation of Israel. And what's striking about that is that, you know, she says, no, you know, if it hadn't been for Jewish agency, there would have been no Israel. It's not like, oh, the Holocaust happened, so we awarded Israel. The Holocaust happened so that for a brief moment the nations of the world were sufficiently shamed that they said, okay, we'll give you a chance, but the Arabs are planning to wipe you out and don't expect us to help you with this. Right? So it's really, you know, I talk about moral schadenfreude, the sort of thrill that you get by enjoying the moral degradation of somebody else. And the moral schadenfreude of Europeans, and this is why the Europeans are so successful, I mean, why the Arabs and the Palestinians are so successful in their replacement narrative, because they're feeding this insatiable appetite on the part of Gentiles to degrade autonomous Jews. It's, you know, it's just staggering to think of the radical unfairness of the way the world has judged Israel in the 21st century. It's like breathtaking.
You know,
Yes.
I want to
Okay.
mention something because I still cannot understand, it's like mind-boggling how Europe keeps on dumping on Israel,
Yes.
regardless of what the Muslims are doing in Europe to Europeans.
Right, right,
So, but
right.
I want
Because
to
they hate
say,
Jews
I
more
one
than they
time
do
was at a
Muslims.
yoga retreat in Paradise Island.
Okay.
And it was actually run by an ex-rabbi who became a guru. And I was like the only Jew there. And somebody said to me, why don't you believe in Jesus? So I said, because, no, this is what she said, and this is what I really think that's why they can't admit guilt, or why they can't take responsibility. Because part of the whole idea was that if you just love everybody, that's fine. You don't have to
Right.
follow rules.
Right,
You don't
right,
have to
right.
feel responsibility. You don't have to feel anything. You just have to love
Feel
everybody.
good.
And as long as you love everybody, they will love you.
Right.
So I said to her, but there has to be some kind of rules, because, you know, you're gonna love somebody who wants to kill you. If you want to love somebody who wants to kill your, you know, family,
Or
how are you
somebody,
gonna love them?
or somebody who manipulates you because you're unconditionally forgiving them.
Yeah, I mean, like, isn't there some kind of line someplace? How can you keep loving everybody? And she got really mad. And I think this is part of the whole Christian thing, that you just have to love everybody, regardless of what they do or don't do. And that way you can be absolved of anything you do or don't do.
So this is known, one of the terms that's come up recently is virtue signaling, which is, I'm signaling to you how virtuous I am. There's a great episode of the Simpsons where Homer buys a Prius and literally drives it all over town to show off that he's bought a Prius. Right? And this is, he's wasting gas, but he's showing. So I think that I think that in Europe, this has become a disease, that you show your virtue by, and Jews show their virtue by denouncing Israel. I'm a good Jew. I'm self-critical, and very often I'm talking to people and I say, tell me what you think Israel's done wrong. And, you know, it's as if you can't, if you defend Israel and you're not critical of Israel, there's something wrong with you. Right? Israel has to have done something wrong. And sure, they've done things wrong. I mean, I think they should have refused to let the Palestinians who were fleeing the Jordanians in 1970 refuge, and then handed them over to Lebanon, where they proceeded to start a civil war that killed 100,000 people. You know, as the rabbinical expression goes, those who were merciful to the cruel will end up being cruel to the merciful. So, Israel's made lots of mistakes, and some of them are, sort of classic mistakes, like Sabra and Shatila shouldn't have happened, or at least we shouldn't have enabled it, and so on. But, this sort of preening about moral superiority is a desperate weakness on the part of the Europeans. There's a great story that Christopher Hitchens tells about why Christians and Muslims don't like Jews. He said, what's the greatest desire of a Christian? To go back and hang with Jesus. And what's the greatest desire of a Muslim? To go back and hang with Muhammad. And the Jews were there both times, and they said, eh.
I was always concerned about putting this idea forth because I was very hesitant about seeming like a conspiratorialist.
Right.
But I have wondered in on the campuses in the last 30 years, and I've been I've been in Columbia for the last 30 years on the faculty, and watched. When I was an undergraduate there, in our days, actually the faculty was very sympathetic to Israel. Back in the day.
Right.
So watching this incredible,
Yes, as Edward Said said, it was a punishing destiny to be a Palestinian.
So, watching this transformation, one of the questions I've had in my head is, does anti-Israelism come out of the postmodernist thing, or is the postmodern narrative created because it's the only way that you can actually make sense out of and justify an anti-Israel thing? Have people like Said and Chomsky created postmodernism because it's the only way they can justify their anti-Israelism? I know that sounds
All right, so
conspiratorial, but does it make sense to you?
In a way, leave Chomsky aside for the moment. Let's go to Said. I have an essay in which I write that the purpose of Orientalism is basically to say, don't you dare criticize us. Any criticism of the Arabs, for instance, for their honor-shame culture, is Orientalist. And so here is a man who is deeply stuck in the honor-shame universe, using Foucaultian language in order to put forward really a very primitive narrative in which we are forbidden to acknowledge the problems in the Arab world. And my point was that I don't think he did this on purpose, but basically what he did was set up our current inability to understand what's going on in the Middle East, because all of the stuff that's coming comes from a ruthless and relentless Arab political culture, comes from very serious problems in the religious world. And these are the things he forbade us. We had to see them the way we see ourselves as, part of this. And this gets back to this notion of, if we're nice to everybody, everybody will be nice to us. And I think a lot of people literally don't want to acknowledge. They don't want to see. They don't want to be at war. They don't want to acknowledge they have enemies. And it's easier to blame Israel for the problem than to blame the people who are really the source of the problem, right? So you have, I've got this, I put together a series of sort of clips from journalists talking about the two-state solution and the occupation, and Bibi isn't in good faith. He says he wants a two-state solution, but he really doesn't, and so on. And you'll never hear them say Abbas is right-wing. You'll never hear them say Abbas is controlled by people who are even to the right of him, that he says publicly he wants a two-state solution, but he doesn't. You'll never hear them say, I've even got, Hala Garani being told by David Keyes that the Palestinians consider Tel Aviv occupied, and she gives him this quizzical look like, where is that coming from? So it's like, it has to be Israel's problem, because first of all, if you criticize Israel, they whine. You criticize the Arabs and you're in trouble. So, and this is one of the, apologies to any people here who will take offense at this, but I think that, as Phyllis Chesler points out, one of the problems with feminism is, it's one thing to take on white males who are subject to guilt and to, when you criticize them, take you seriously. And it's another thing to take on Arab males who will, really fight back. And so what do? They're wimps with the Arabs, and they're ferocious with the honkies. Yes.
They told you, I'm an Israeli woman from West Bank. I'm in a settlement in Israel, and we built some a new terrace.
Right. Oh,
Probably
so you're one of the people who's holding up robots.
Right.
Right.
I was trying to follow what you say was a little bit difficult, the speed, but I wonder, we try to identify what are the roots for anti-Semitism. We try to understand where it comes from. We try to learn what they think. But what are the actions that we try to do against anti-Semitism? Maybe, I don't know, maybe education, maybe to teach the world some good stuff about Israel, about Judaism, about good values.
So there's a great book by Fiamma Nierenstein.
Just 1 second. Who?
Fiamma Nierenstein. She's an Italian Israeli. She served in the Italian parliament. And she wrote a book called Israel is Us. And it's addressed to the Italians, and it's basically saying, look, you should be looking to Israel for the courage that you lack. And, there was an interesting talk by Richard Kemp at a conference that the JCPA in Israel held about the Balfour Declaration. And he talks about how, in the same week that the European Union is denouncing Israel for how many civilians it's killed, NATO is showing up on the doorstep of the Israelis saying, how can we kill fewer people in Iraq and Afghanistan? So there's this literally a kind of schizophrenic condition in which on the one hand they recognize this, on the other hand they can't bear to absorb it. So I agree with you that education is good at it.
Maybe to tell everybody about all the inventions that,
well,
there's
what
what
no
would you do
cameras-
without Facebook?
Oh, there's a
and
lot. No, there's a lot of people who are doing this, and that's the book Startup Nation, and there's actually a good book by a non-Jew called The Israel Test.
Maybe not only books, but maybe do stuff in the colleges and universities where you have to stand up and.
Well, there's a group called Stand With Us that does it. Look, there are.
ISGAP's in the university, so we're doing it.
Right. So, the point is, you're right. Partly the reason you're saying, why aren't we doing this, is because it took us so long to get around to doing it. But I gotta tell you, when I go to websites, The Guardian, The Times, The New York Times, Le Monde, Le Monde less, but in the Anglophone world, there's a lot of pushback now that there wasn't. When I first started working on Dula, it was 2003. I couldn't get the Israeli government to take it seriously.
Right.
And there was literally, there was this tsunami of Israel hatred that hit the world, and we were standing there, the shit hit the fan, and we were open-mouthed inhaling when it hit. And a lot of us swallowed the poison. Most people, I would say maybe half of Jews know that this was, or think that this was staged. The vast majority of Westerners think he died and that we killed him, that, maybe it was by accident, or we didn't mean it, it wasn't in cold blood like the cameraman and the father said. But,
we need to do a film about this.
Oh, I've done them.
There are many,
Done 'em.
many, but Jews go.
Yes.
This past Sunday, I attended the Israel Day parade, probably along with everybody in this room.
Okay.
And there was only one country besides Israel in the
That was
parade,
there.
the Chinese. The only country.
Wow.
And you know, you start to think about it. Why is it only China at the Israel Day parade? Well, because the China. Now, I'm just speaking. I'm an immigration lawyer, like
Okay.
Marty. So I'm immersed in passports and nationality
Right.
and national identity,
Right.
and so you think about what the EU stands for is what? Anti-nationalism. It stands for supranationalism.
Yeah.
What we stand for, what the Torah stands for, I don't know what the Chinese, I would assume the Chinese have something similar to us, is ultranationalism. And what could be worse in modern times
Right.
than ultranationalism?
Right.
You know, we pray for each other's health. We pray to gather in the exiles. This is what we build Jerusalem together. You could build all the iPhones and all the Facebooks and cure every disease. It's not going to help. It's not going to help. I don't mean to sound defeatist or anything like that.
Right.
So what,
But there's just, if you're occupying another person's land, a murderer can still can cure a disease. A doctor can kill his wife and yet save somebody from a heart attack. Doesn't, if you know what I'm getting at.
My allergy doctor killed his wife.
You're allergist. So it's not a question of,
Killed his wife.
it's whether we're on the wrong side of history or not.
So listen, we're actually on the right side of history.
Okay.
But I was listening to this today. There's an interview, a long and interesting interview with this guy Bert Weinstein from Evergreen College, the one who was sort of surrounded. Yeah.
He's a
yeah.
good one.
Right,
And
right.
they eat their own.
Right. So one of the things that he said was, you know, apparently now the people, the administration as well as the students are claiming they didn't tell whites that they shouldn't come to campus. And he's got emails from the administration telling white people not to come to campus that day. And so the guy's saying, well, you know, don't they understand that they're going to get caught out and they're going to be liars? I mean, this is, you know, real data. And he said something about them, you know, you'd think that they would understand they should be on the right side of history. And I was thinking, they think they're on the right side of history. I mean, this is what, I was in France in 2005 when they were trying to pass the EU constitution was sort of being voted on in different countries. And the way that the thing was presented to the French is, this is the train of history and we've got to get on. And if we don't, we're going to get left behind. Now, I think that there's a very internationalism, cosmopolitanism, postmodern, you know, sort of, we're all the same, and we, as somebody put it, the anywhere people versus the somewhere people, right? You're saying Jews are somewhere people, and even though we've been everywhere people, and I mean, it's ironic that, you know, for centuries we were despised as rootless cosmopolitans, and now all of a sudden we're the people who are rooted, and they're all the cosmopolitans. But I strongly recommend Rabbi Sachs's book, The Dignity of Difference. And I think that one of the things that he points out, and I think that this is the train of history, the arc of history, it's clearly going to take some time to work itself out. His point is that Jews are universalist by their particularism. We are a people, and we are not like other people, but we can get along with other people. One of the problems for the cosmopolitans is that they view all patriotism as zero-sum. If you're patriotic, then you have to hate everybody else. And therefore, because we love everybody else, we'd rather hate our own than... and I think that Jews represent a positive sum national identity, and that's what the world needs. It really needs... You can't have human rights without the nation state. The idea that you can sort of... you know, Eleanor Roosevelt, you know, with the human rights, universal human rights at the UN and stuff. You can't do that, and it's been a total failure, and it's in fact corrupted the groups that tried to do it, whether it's the UN groups or, you know, Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch and stuff. These groups who think that they can just sort of say it and it'll work, and applies around the world, are, you know, they live in a fantasy world.
Do you know
So-
why the Chinese people, they came? They feel very much, first of all, they think that we are the same size, the Jew nationality and the Chinese.
Well, in America,
They
the Chinese
assume-
are the next Jews.
They assume that we are more or less the same size as they are, and we are very much kadmonim.
Ancient.
Ancient.
Yeah, ancient. We are more
Right,
or
we're
less
as
from
old
the
as they
same.
are,
Yeah,
right.
the same, and we have the same values. And they think that we are like a twin nation.
Right, right.
Yeah, I know. I've been in China, and I was told that this is how they look about. Because otherwise, how can you hear so much about Israel
Right,
and see
right,
so
right.
many Israelis
Right.
everywhere in China,
All right.
and have all the companies that
Right.
are so most of the Chinese people
Yeah.
who travel assume that Israel and China are yeah.
The Human Rights Film Festival is in New York.
Oh my God.
Oh, yes. And this Sunday night, if you're in New York, they have a film about a boy from Gaza who goes to an Israeli hospital with his grandfather, and his grandfather is trapped there
Right,
by
right,
the
right.
by our laws of a nationality and passport. Just wanted to give you something to do on Sunday night.
What is that? What is that? GBS?
Human Rights Watch Film Festival, a Sunday night at Lincoln Center, is a film about Gaza.
Yes.
Oh.
Mark.
As inevitably the terrorism of Arabs within, or Muslims within Europe intensifies,
Right.
do you suppose that the response in Europe is going to be largely that, oh, you know, we're Israel now, I get it what's going on.
I get it.
Or do you think that they're going to say, you know, if
If it weren't for Israel, this wouldn't be happening.
this wouldn't be happening.
Okay, so,
Right.
so look, this gets back to, let's go all the way back to Bereshit and God's statement to Abraham, those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will I'll curse. Essentially what God did was to give the Gentiles the freedom of will to either bless us or curse us. And the fact is, historically speaking, that those who blessed us have been blessed, and those who curse us have cursed themselves. The Spanish kicked us out in the end of the 15th century, and in the 16th century they had this huge flood of wealth, particularly gold, coming from the New World, and it washed through Spain like, kafikim b'negev. It was just, there were no roots there, there was nothing to hold it there were no Jews there. And the Arabs kicked us out in 1948, and, for all their trillions in petrol dollars, there's still primitive societies in which the vast majority of the people, even in oil-rich countries like Libya or Algeria, are miserable. They're miserable. So, basically, the Europeans, the way I put it is, the Europeans have a choice. They can continue to indulge their hostility towards us. They can continue to indulge their hostility towards us, on the one hand, and go down. They are going down. Or they can pull out of it. And the only way Europe will be able to survive is if it genuinely gives up its anti-Jewish tendencies. Genuinely gives them up. And ironically, will it happen? I see my job as to try and create a discourse that, as things get worse and more people become open to rethinking their situation, because it's only going to get worse, they can hear it. Not easy, yes.
As a proud Israeli for 50 years now, I have some reservations about what you said. What I want to ask you is, don't you think that I don't say self-deprecation,
Right.
but self-criticism is a Jewish trait?
Absolutely.
And that Jews should always be sensitive to the other side and see the things that maybe we should be doing and be critical
Yeah,
of also what we are doing.
I agree, except that the tendency of Israelis is to believe that our fate is in our hands. And actually, one of my Israeli friends said to me, after the Intifada, the second Intifada, I realized, I said, "Lo biyadenu," it's not in our hands. You get out of the West Bank, you are not going to solve anything. You're going to make things worse. It's not possible.
What do you mean to criticize? I think it says what? What's wrong? What?
Nothing's wrong.
What?
Terrible traffic.
I have 12 grandchildren in Israel, and I
Fantastic.
don't want my grandsons to have to go into Arab houses and cause the young children in the Arab houses to get more hatred against Jews and against Israel. So I would like to find a solution that would be good for all
A
sides.
much better thing would be that the Arab children can come to our homes and do what they know to do very well.
But I don't want us to continue to be in this situation.
Okay,
You want
but
us to continue to
But wait a minute.
just
wait a
not do anything.
What's your solution?
What's your solution? To just continue the way it is?
No, what's your
And hope
solution?
for the best?
What's your
Herzl failed in geography. We should have, we shouldn't have constructed a state. That's all. What if we didn't construct a state? We wouldn't have
No
any
problem.
problem. There wouldn't be any of us.
Right.
We wouldn't have a nation.
I
We wouldn't
left
have a
America
nationality.
for Israel, okay? I live in Israel. I'm a patriot. I want
I
Israel
understand.
to continue to exist for generations, and we have to
Forever.
find a way to do it.
Right, so listen, I think
So
part of the
what do
problem
you
here-
want your grandchildren
Wait,
to do?
wait,
I
wait,
mean,
So
what?
wait.
To
I want
stay
them
and
to
do
be
like
critical.
this?
Wait,
Because
wait.
No, she wants to find a solution that's good for everybody. And the problem with finding a solution that's good for everybody is we are dealing with a zero-sum culture. Arafat said no to Camp David because a negotiated positive-sum settlement in which both sides win, in his world, is a shameful loss. And as one of the mottos
couldn't.
that's
He wanted,
written
but
over
he
the
couldn't.
wall
He killed.
of
Yeah.
many Abdullah illustrations is that which was taken by force must be retaken by force. So, and if you want to do something towards that end, then start pressuring the left, the progressives around the world to start holding Palestinian feet to the fire instead of constantly reinforcing
What
their
do we have?
phony
Hey, wait a
sense of
minute,
grievance.
she's talking.
Their phony sense of grievance at what we've done to them. They do far worse to their own people than we do to them, and we feel terrible about doing it to them. They don't feel terrible about doing it to their own people, and they would love to be able to do it to us. So if the progressives in the world want to come to a positive some solution that's good for everybody, they got to start working on the Palestinians instead of feeding their disgusting sense of victimization at our hands. Now, you're right. Look, Jews are by nature moral perfectionists. We're never satisfied. There's always got to be something more than we can do. But we're in a situation right now where the more we do, the worse we make it. The more concessions we make to them, the more that registers with them as weakness and a call for further aggression. That's why the negotiations have gone nowhere.
There haven't been any negotiations.
There have been plenty of negotiations and they've gone nowhere. And every time the West goes, oh, come on, Israel, make another concession. I'm sure this time it'll work. And there are plenty of Israelis who say, come on, let's make another concession. Maybe this time it'll work.
In they go, oops.
Yeah, no, they don't go, oops, they say it's your fault.
Right.
Why are we giving everything away?
Israel says we are open-handed to all the Arabs and to everybody to come and live with us.
They don't wanna live with you.
Okay, but
But they don't wanna
All
live
right.
with you.
they want us in this city.
And then we gotta
I
stop.
get that.
No, you don't.
Have you a website?
Yes,
That's what I
Augean's,
was, I don't see it there in front of
hang
me.
on there.
It was, he passed it, he's gotta go back.
www.theaugeanstables.com.
Eugene Stable.
That's my blog.
No.
Why are we giving things away?
Really?
Why
Because we
why-
think it'll make things better, and it's making
Well,
things worse.
maybe after 2,000 years of being in exile,
Right?
we're in a rock, and culminating in a Holocaust, maybe we need a few hundred years like the Brits to get pride and to become less neurotic. I worked in trying to find leaders in this country who will stand up and take stands,
Right.
and they're not there. And why?
Look, as a historian, and as a historian who has a reasonable command of the last 2,000 plus years, I do think in longer terms than most beauty-afflicted modern people tend to think. And so I agree with you that this is going to be a long process. Part of it is, I would like to substitute, my wife doesn't like this, but she also doesn't like verbal defecation. I would like to substitute for occupation the term headlock. We have the Palestinians in a headlock. They're trying to kill us, and we've wrestled them into a headlock where they can't kill us, and we can't let go because as soon as we do, they try and kill us again. And so, you know, I'm sorry that we have to be mean to the Palestinians, but we are so much nicer to them than any Arab country has been, would be, and certainly if they were faced with the kind of viciousness that we're faced with. We are, actually have a good Palestinian friend, Bassem Eid, who says, you know,
He's very good.
the Palestinians should thank their lucky stars every day that they have the nicest enemy on the planet.
I've seen him, he's phenomenal, I heard him speak, oh man. We should be
Well,
proud of
first a
that.
year ago.
Yes, we should be.
Yeah.
Did you
He
say
is
that
one
envy
grateful
creates
Palestinian.
anti-Semitism?
I think envy is one
Okay,
of
so
the
then
drivers.
Israel
of it.
21C, all
Yeah,
that
yeah.
stuff is doing exactly the opposite
Okay,
of what
so-
needs to be done.
right.
I just want to say one more thing on
Right,
this.
uh-huh.
That the weakness, the kindness that we show probably has the opposite effect. They don't respect kindness, and the kinder we are, that we're
They see it as
asking for the
weakness.
same thing.
They see it as weakness, but it's something else too. There was we had a panel on Honor Shane in Jerusalem, and one of the people who spoke was Harold Rode. Was it Harold or somebody else? Somebody pointed out that in 1994, after the signing of the Oslo Accords, there was a meeting in Tunis, you know, a Shimon Peres inspired meeting in Tunis for, you know, economic development in the Middle East, right? Because that was his vision. We're going to make the Middle East. So the Israelis show up with all these projects, and they're, you know, so eager. And he said, and the Arabs felt that they were shaming them. They felt shamed. You know, it's like being a second grader in a graduate class. You can't help but feel inadequate. And the more eager we are, the worse it is. And the problem is that rather than the left, the progressives in the West, being good therapists for the Arabs, they are the most mischievous players in exaggerating and exacerbating everything wrong about the Palestinian response to us, the Arab response.
We have a problem also amongst us, even in this room,
Yeah.
disrespecting our own. I remember Pesach 1976.
Okay.
Moshe Aarons, my cousin on the Mare Line, was walking the streets of New York. He had no place to go, no hotel room. Nobody would let him in. He was walking by himself, and nobody would say anything to him to help him out. he rang on our doorbell, and my mother and father, Jean and Ernest Fine, Daniel Fine, they said, "Hi, me, sitting right here, is the only person in the world that could let Moshe Aaron's in." So it's
What, they knew he was Moshe Aaron and said we wanted
no, he's my
anything to do
cousin.
with you?
No, he's my cousin. My father hated his
Okay.
guts. I'm the middle one.
Any final remarks?
All right, good work. One last comment.
Well, there are two things. I'll be very brief. The today's column, Tuesday's column by Carolyn Glick, has a number of very interesting facts, including Syrian Palestinians and what has happened to the refugee camps in Syria. And the world doesn't give a crap. And the Michael Oren had an opinion piece in the New York Times on the anniversary of the Six-Day War, pointing out that it wasn't the Six-Day War in 1967 that changed the Middle East for the Palestinians, and it wasn't 1948, and it wasn't 1937. All the partition things had nothing to do with it. It was 1917 in the Balfour Declaration, where they refused the idea that the Jews have a right to a state.
Right.
It was a very nice little piece. I don't think he went far enough back, but that's all right. Oh, the other thing from Carol Glick, she mentioned the statistics about the Israel Day Parade.
Right.
This year there were 40,000 participants, mainly Orthodox. In previous years there were 100,000.
It was very clear, that was very true. It was sad.
Wow. So let me conclude with your remark about the fate of Syrian and Lebanese refugees. There was recently a piece I just posted at my blog about this. There was a funding appeal from UNRWA, which took a picture of a Syrian girl and presented her as a poor Gazan girl victim of Israeli, right. And one of the things that shows you is the degree to which the alleged concern for the Palestinians is only for Palestinians when they're victims of Israel. If they're victims of Arabs, they're of no interest whatsoever. So the insincerity of the concern for Palestinians on the part of progressives and the need to crap on Israel.
I think that's the prima facie case for the anti-Semitism that underlies it.
So we're not standing up. We're not taking responsibility to fight what we see happening right under our noses. And so we're part of it. We have responsibility from our side too.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you all. Feel free to converse for a few minutes. Thank you, Dr. Landis. And stay tuned for what we have coming up in the fall.
That's it for the season?